Hey folks, what's going on? Matt Weiss here. It's real late at night, but I really wanted to make a video and get it out to you. So if I'm a little bit off in my energy, don't blame me. It's been a long week. So yeah, I'm going to show a technique here, but there's a bigger picture to this technique than the technique itself. But let's start with the technique itself here. So we've got just the drums and bass going that I'm going to play on the hook here. It sounds fine. There's nothing that's really bad about it necessarily, but I wanted a little bit more movement, particularly between the kick and the 808. So the way that I'm going to do this is first I'm going to put a little bit of extra edge into the kick here. So just using a transient designer to give it a little bit of low mids and lows. Nothing crazy going on here yet. Cool. Next thing that's going on is my air conditioner is kicking on, so there's noise in the background. Sorry about that. Okay, so now the relationship between the kick and the 808, I want to just make sure that that's the best that it can be, so I always just check the polarity here just to make sure that it sounds the best to my ear. And to me, when it was flipped, it sounded a little better, but it's pretty close. It's not really like a humongous difference at all. So nothing here happening out of the ordinary. Here's where the interesting stuff happens. I'm going to bring in the plugin before I show you what it is. So here's the before, then the after. And you notice two things happen that are really interesting. The first is that the kick drum just seems to fly forward. The second is that the groove seems to punch through in a much chewier, fuller, more compelling way. So what is happening? Well, I'm doing a sort of unique approach to ducking in the sense that I'm kind of reverse ducking. Normally in a ducking configuration, you would have something where the kick is going through a side chain, which is exactly what's happening here, and then you would have a compressor that is keyed to that side chain, which again is what's happening here. And you would have a compressor set up so that every time the kick hits, the bass gets attenuated. And this typical technique is used when we're trying to make space so that the kick can be more articulated. But it works particularly well on droning basses like this. But I actually kind of reversed this technique. So instead of having it so that the subs duck every time the kick hits, the subs are actually doing the opposite. They're expanding, they're being turned up. Watch what happens. Kind of interesting, right? So every time the kick hits, the sub on the bass is pushing and the primary bass range on the bass is ducking. So it's kind of an interesting configuration. Why? Why am I doing this? Well, it's because the 808 felt like it was a little bit flat, dynamically speaking. I wanted to give it a little bit more motion. I also felt like there could be a little bit more sub overall. Where I get that sub from? Well, I could get the sub from the kick, or I could get the sub from the subbiest instrument, which in this case is the 808. So I'm doing it dynamically, triggering it with the kick. It's providing a little extra sub, it's providing extra dynamic in the 808, and then to clarify the kick, I'm actually ducking in the primary bass range where we hear a lot of that knock. So it's got a lot of things happening that just make the kick and the bass work together in a really, really cool way. So I'm going to bring in the rest of the drums here and give you a quick little before and after. So it fattens up the sound and it gives it a little bit more bounce and a little bit more punch and a little bit more energy. And that's the way that I'm getting this really chewy, dense, heavy low end that still has a lot of bounce to it. Now, the bigger picture of this approach is that the typical technique would be something more like this. I would be taking the compressor I'd still have it triggered, but instead of being in expander mode, I would be in compression mode, and my range would go down, something like this. And if I do this before and after, what you'll notice is that the kick gains a lot of clarity. Right, it cleans up the sub-range, which can be a very, very useful and powerful technique. However, that's not what this record needed. What the record needed was something that was a little bit more energized and dynamic and fuller in that low range, something that had a little bit more dynamics. So I reversed the technique. The point of this is to show that a lot of the times I do things that might seem counterintuitive to, say, the typical way that things might be done. And the reason why that is because I'm so aware and versed in the standard approaches to things and techniques that have been around for a long time. I've had a chance to experiment with those techniques and try things that may seem counterintuitive or go against the grain. A common, or not necessarily a common example, but an example that has come up a few times and actually came up in this channel, I think a couple weeks ago, where I did some EQing where I ended up kind of pushing a certain frequency range and then pulling that same frequency range down later. But I did it with different EQs in different places in the chain. And that is not that usually that when you see that happening, it's somebody who's just really overprocessing things. I have found that sometimes I can do a boost and cut kind of a thing, and because of where it sits in the chain and what I'm reacting to, it doesn't really sound the same as just completely canceling out the EQ and bypassing it. It creates a different flavor, and actually that's happening in this record as well. So once this record is out, I'll show that as well, because I think it's important to be thinking outside the box and being willing to try things. Anytime a certain technique is explained, delivered, or taken for granted, always try to see what could be an alternate possibility. So like, what would be a good example? People say boost wide, cut narrow, right? That's a general rule of thumb when we're talking about EQ. If you're doing EQ boosts, you generally want to be doing a wider range. If you are doing EQ cuts, you want to be doing something that's more targeted. And as a general rule of thumb, there is some truth to that, but why not experiment with what happens if you boost narrow? Why not experiment with what happens when you cut wide? These are all still possible techniques that could have use. And sometimes narrow boosts on things like drums can sound really good. Sometimes even narrow boosts on vocals can sound really good if you happen to find a sweet spot or something like that. So just because certain techniques are said and propagated throughout the internet space and common understanding doesn't mean that we should necessarily take them for granted and do that stuff exactly as it's being proposed. And we should almost always take that as an opportunity to try doing the opposite or turning that technique on its head just to see what's going to happen. All right, I hope that you dig this video. How do I wrap these videos up again? I'm so out of it and exhausted. All right, hit that like button if you dig this video. Hit subscribe if you want to catch more videos like this. And of course, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.